Hello and welcome to episode 34 of Question and Answer. We are slowly and gradually working our way up to 6 gorillion. And my chair is squeaking. Maybe I should start over, but nah. So I guess the big news for me today is a creature resembling a heron or possibly a pterodactyl came and invaded our yard and I think possibly ate all of our fish in the pond, including possibly even my loaches. So please send your thoughts and prayers for my loaches. And also, for the few of you that have my phone number, very few of you, I hope, my phone died due to everything, all conditioned things being impermanent, inconstant and all. And although I got a new phone, I've lost all my contacts. So if you want to be on my contact list again, assuming that you were on it before, just shoot me a text and that'll take care of it. So we got the usual large number of good questions. And I don't know, I don't think we got any bad questions at all, to tell you the truth. So I'll just wade into this list of questions. And the first question, the first several questions, in fact, are from Mary, spelled M-E-R-R-Y. And Mary's first question here is another question regarding robes. You said monks are not allowed to wear lay people's clothing, but in the time of the Buddha, everybody wore robes and monks wore robes. So I don't fully understand. Well, it is true that in the Buddhist time, lay people did wear robes resembling what monks' robes were like. It's just like a rectangle of cloth wrapped around your body in a certain way, kind of toga-like, I think. But the thing is, the lay people wore white robes, and monks wore robes that were discolored, usually dyed a kind of golden brown color. And also, monks were required to cut the cloth up and sew it back together, unless it was just made out of rags that were sewn together. But even if they got like new cloth, or they just picked up a shroud at a cemetery that was one big piece of cloth, which still happens sometimes, like in Asia, I mean, then they'd have to cut it up and sew it back together to make the cloth less valuable, because apparently there were cloth thieves in northern India, in the Ganges Valley, in the Buddhist time. In fact, there are quite a few rules designed to prevent your robes from being stolen. In fact, there's a strange rule for bhikkhunis, or ordained Buddhist nuns, that they weren't allowed to bathe naked unless there were lots of thieves nearby, in which case they could bathe naked just so that they wouldn't get their robes stolen, which is kind of a strange rule. So, yeah, the difference between the robes that lay people wore and the robes that monks wore in the Buddhist time were that monks' robes were dyed kind of a dingy brownish color, and also they were cut up into pieces and sewn back together again. Other than that, it is true that the lay people wore robes sort of similar to what Theravada Buddhist monks wear today. So I'll just move on to Mary's next question. Also, were there early Buddhist schools that maybe if existing today would be better for us all? I mean those of us who don't really care about Abhidhamma, but solely the suttas. Almost all of the ancient Indian schools pre-Mahayana had some kind of Abhidhamma or Abhidharma, except there was one called the Sautrantika school, which means suttas only or sutras only, and they just made a special point of not having any Abhidhamma or Abhidharma, and just basing their philosophy on the suttas themselves. And according to A.K. Warder, in his History of Indian Buddhism, he was saying that the Sautrantika school was one of the more conservative schools, although he also says Theravada was one of the most conservative of all the schools. So maybe Sautrantika might be more suitable for Westerners who don't take Abhidhamma seriously, but it's really not that difficult to just disregard Abhidhamma as much as you can. It's fairly easy in the West. In Burma, it's a little more difficult because in Burma, Abhidhamma is considered to be the most profound and most important of the teachings of the Buddha, even though most Westerners do not believe that the Buddha actually taught it. So, yeah, there was the Sautrantika school, which didn't have an Abhidhamma. But we are fairly lucky. I think we're very, very lucky that of the ancient schools, the ancient Indian pre-Mahayana schools that survived, well, we got Theravada, which really was one of the most conservative, who made the most effort to stay faithful to what the historical Buddha originally taught. At the second council, or shortly after the second council, there was the first major schism, and you had the Theras on one side, or the Staviras, which is Sanskrit for Theras, and you had the Mahasangha on the other side. And the Mahasangha, they put more emphasis on personal inspiration and sort of keeping the text alive. You know, the sutras are a living document, so to speak. And although they did maintain maybe a higher level of inspiration just because they weren't as dogmatic and adhering to words and books, nevertheless, they just took the ball and ran with it, and then you wind up with all sorts of strange teachings. And it was the Mahasangha school also that gradually developed into Mahayana. At least that's what I've read. So let's see. So I guess I answered that question. So I'll just move on to Mary's next question. And this is with reference to something I said in a previous video. I said that when I was a monk, I did not experience thirst. That well, I'll just give you the question here. So it's, how is it that you were never thirsty? As a white guy in Myanmar, you probably sweat a lot more than autochthons, which is Aboriginal peoples, I think, native peoples, and you have never felt thirst. Okay, well, when I was a kid, I felt thirsty, but then at some point, I think while I was a monk, I just stopped feeling thirst. And so I would just drink as a habit. You know, I just make sure to stay hydrated. I read a survival guide a long time ago. It was like an outdated U.S. Army survival guide, saying that you should always drink enough that your pee stays relatively colorless. You know, you don't want like dark orange pee. And so I just go by that. Or if I just start feeling dizzy, sometimes my mouth would start going dry, I'd know that I was getting dehydrated, and then I would just drink. But I did not feel the sensation of thirst. And I don't remember exactly when it stopped. It was just finally I just realized, wow, I just do not feel thirsty ever anymore. And then after I became a layperson again, as you can see, I'm not wearing robes, I started feeling thirsty again, which is kind of strange. I really can't explain it. Hopefully it's not a symbolic thing, because according to the Four Noble Truths, the cause of all suffering is tanha, usually translated as craving, but literally it means thirst. But yeah. So yeah, I just did not feel thirst for years and years. It was just, I would have other indications that I needed to drink something, like orange pee, or just being like dizzy and lightheaded and my mouth going dry, that kind of thing. So I'll just move on to the next question, also by Mary. What was the day when you were the most frightened in your whole life? I'm just curious because you do not seem as a person that is being scared very easily. Well, that's kind of a tough one. I mean, once when I was a kid, maybe 7 years old, the neighbor kids who were older than me held me over the side of a bridge, like head down. And yeah, that's being kind of head down on a roof or something, like working on a roof, and you got to be kind of head down, like you're cleaning gutters or something. Yeah, that's one thing that there's just this visceral, like instinctive um, fear, I guess would be the word. But if you're referring to my adult life, um, yeah, I've had like one panic attack in my life, and that was I'd been a monk for 20 years maybe, and I was visiting the USA to see my parents, and an old friend of mine wanted to go camping with me. And this old friend of mine, he smokes like a Rastafari. I mean, he's just smoking out all the time. And I used to smoke a lot of weed before I was a monk, and so I got high with him, and he just got me. I mean, I could not keep up with him. I mean, I was just an absolute total lightweight at the time. He was a heavyweight. I mean, he smoked like Bob Marley or something. And I remember he had like some kind of Mexican devil mask up on his wall, and that was starting to kind of weird me out. I asked him if he'd take it down, which he did. And I was really, really high. And we went to bed, or he went to bed, and I'm hearing these strange like footstep noises, and I'm looking out into the living room. I was in the guest bedroom, and there's nothing there. It's all silent and everything, and I'm hearing these footsteps again, and I just started getting like paranoid or something. I just started having like a panic attack. So I started yelling for my friend, who comes out like very confused in his underwear. He'd just been woken up, and I just, it was like I asked if I could give him a hug, just because that was sort of like just the physical contact would assure me that everything was okay. So he kind of grinned and gave me a hug and went back to bed, and everything was okay after that. But it started a kind of tradition. We give each other a hug like when we'd meet after that. So yeah, I guess it was like a drug-induced panic attack would be. But being scared, as a general rule, I mean, from the Buddhist point of view, it's like bad karma. I mean, if you are frightened, if fear just starts to arise, please excuse the squeaky chair, but if fear arises, I mean, that's just past karma from the Buddhist point of view. So the first arising of it is not, you're not making any new bad karma. That's sort of like unskillful karma from the past. It's just the momentum of it is causing it to arise again. But if you like take it seriously and dwell on it, then you're making new bad karma. So I really took that to heart. Once you read the text and you believe that, I mean, it doesn't help anything. Being afraid really doesn't help anything. It evolved in our pre-human ancestors, just as a way of saving your life. If you're too stupid to analyze the situation, it's just if you're scared, run. And it apparently had some survival value in the past, but we've gotten to the level, at least some of us have, where you're intelligent enough that you can do what is appropriate without being scared. In fact, being scared can just really interfere with your judgment. So yeah, I mean, I have been in relatively scary situations. Like, um, I went through a few years, well, several years in Burma, where I would, every year I'd hike through Alando Katapa National Park, right through the middle of the park. And there were tigers there. I wasn't so much afraid of tigers as wild boars, though, because I've been told that you're more likely to be attacked by wild pigs than tigers, because there aren't very many tigers. You're much more likely to come across wild boars. And so I would just camp, just sleep under a tree. I didn't have a sleeping bag or anything. I just lie on the ground under a tree. I'd have like a little plastic thing that I could, just keep me off the dirt. But I'd always sleep under a easily climbable tree. And if fear would start to arise, you hear a twig snap out in the darkness, just this immediate, what's that kind of a feeling. I mean, you just watch it. There are suttas in the texts where if fear arises, you master the fear before you do anything else. If you're doing walking meditation and fear arises, you just keep doing the walking meditation until the fear passes, and then you can change posture. Or if you're sitting or whatever, you just do not change your position or your posture until you have mastered the fear. And I mean, it's relatively straightforward, just mindfulness meditation. You just observe the fear, and then it's not you anymore. I've talked about this before. Like, anything you can observe isn't you, because if you are anything at all, you're the one doing the observing and not the thing being observed. So if you can observe your mental states, your mental states are not you. So fear arises, you observe the fear, you've already created a separation between you, assuming that you really exist, and the fear, assuming that the fear really exists. So it's not I'm scared anymore, it's fear is arising. But that one panic attack I had, it was, when it's just like this visceral thing that just kind of takes over, then yeah, practicing mindfulness, it might not even occur to you at the time. So that's a long question to a short answer. So I'll just move on to the next question. I know I'm crossing the line here, but for a something-year-old man, I am just wondering, what is your spouse's age? So my sweetheart is 12 years younger than me, which coincidentally is also the age differential between my parents. My father was 12 years older than my mother. So yeah, it's not that I'm vain about my own age. I just don't want to be like divulging my sweetheart's age, because it's not gallant, shall we say. So let's just move on to Mary's last question. How many dhutanga practices did you practice, and what were they? Well, as a monk isn't supposed to say what his dhutanga practices are. But I suppose I should say what dhutanga practices are, just for those of you who don't know what dhutanga practices are. There are 13 optional practices, ascetic practices, that a monk is allowed to do in Theravada Buddhism. They're called dhutangas. And I mean, they're completely optional. And if you do them, the only person you're supposed to tell is your own teacher. You can take dhutanga practices from your teacher, and then only you and he will know. In fact, in the Visuddhimagga, which is the main commentarial text in Theravada Buddhism, there's a story about these two monks who just happened to be sharing a cabin one night. And one of them was doing the sitter's practice, which is a dhutanga where you never lie down, you sleep in a sitting position. And there was a thunderstorm that night, and there was a flash of lightning, and the whole cabin lit up inside. And the other monk could see that the first monk wasn't lying down; he was sitting there on his bed. And so he asked him, "Do you do the sitting practice?" And so, in order not to be telling anybody about his dhutangas, he just lay down and said no. And then the very next night, he started doing it again, and he'd been doing it for years and years. So I was kind of like that. I mean, I suppose I should list off some of the main dhutangas. And if you really want to know about dhutangas, I'm pretty sure it's in chapter 2 of the Visuddhimagga. So one of them is, as I just said, you just do not lie down. You sleep in a sitting position. One is living in cemeteries. One is living under the open sky. One is living in a forest. One is only eating alms food You don't accept invitations to people's houses, anything like that. You just take your bowl and walk through the village every day. Let's see, another one is wearing only 3 robes, which is kind of a fishy one. It's because according to the rules of monastic discipline, you're really only allowed to wear 3 robes anyway. If you have an extra robe, you can only keep it for 10 days. Wearing only rag robes, like robes made out of rags that you pick up off the ground. Let's see, eating only once a day, eating only 1 meal a day. Let's see, there's kind of an obscure one where you don't wait if people ask you to wait when you're walking for alms. Like, wait a minute, I want to go back to my house and get something, or you're not supposed to wait. There's another one where you just go systematically house by house. You don't skip over the houses that give bad food, that kind of a thing. Let's see, I don't know how many I've listed off, but there are 13 altogether. And I really didn't try to make a big deal out of dhutanga practice. I mean, I lived in forests a lot. I lived in cemeteries briefly from time to time. I ate just one meal a day, pretty much for 30 years, with very few exceptions. I always kept only 3 robes, although I did allow myself to keep an extra robe for 10 days. Like, you got an old robe and you make a new one. So then you got the new one and the old one. You got 10 days to get rid of the old one. So I did that. Let's see, I did the sitting practice for over a year, which was difficult. Yeah, it's really hard to get used to sleeping in a sitting position. And there were a few times where, you'd fall asleep sitting, but then you'd wake up kind of like on your side on the floor. So let's see, rag robes, it was just too difficult because, especially in Southeast Asia or in Burma, which is a poor country anyway, by the time people throw their cloth away, it's pretty much, just shredded rags. I suppose I should add that each dhutanga, according to the Visuddhimagga, has 3 levels. It's got like easy, medium, and hard. And for example, with the sitting practice, the easy way is like sitting in a chair when you sleep. And the medium level is you're able to lean back against a board, or else you can also use a kind of belt thing around like your knees and your back to just hold you up in a sitting position. And then finally, the hard practice is you're just sitting, not leaning back against anything. You're just sitting there like you're meditating, sleeping. And I was ordained in the Tongpulu tradition where all the monks did this practice. It was just like a thing that the Tongpulu monks did. They didn't lie down. But when I got to Burma, I was a monk for more than a year in a Burmese place in California before I went to Burma. But when I got to Burma, it was just so hot that I wanted to be as cool as possible. Leaning back against anything, it would just get foul with sweat. So I quickly learned that the coolest way to sleep is like spread eagle on a concrete floor. So I started sleeping just on a concrete floor, sometimes using a piece of wood for a pillow, not because I wanted to be ascetic. It was literally, that was the most comfortable way of sleeping. And the piece of wood for a pillow just didn't soak up sweat like a cloth pillow would. But I did try to downplay any kind of dhutangas. Like I ate 1 meal a day, but what I would do sometimes just to break the dhutanga is I'd be sitting there eating, then I would just get up, take a step to the left, take a step to the right again, sit back down and finish my meal, so that I wasn't doing it all in one sitting. Because that's the way it's worded. The dhutanga practice is it's the one sitter's practice. So yeah, it's so, I mean, really, I can't say how many dhutanga practices I did because it was sort of incidental. Like living in a forest, I just like living in forests. And there's the 3 robes, that's just following the rules of monastic discipline literally anyway. And 1 meal a day, I don't know. So yeah, I can't really say how many I practiced. Probably maybe 3 or 4 were pretty much full time, and then there was a few extra ones like sleeping in a cemetery, where if I was traveling, like there was a town called Kani that whenever I would stay there, I'd always stay in the cemetery there, which had a really nice pavilion. So, and you could just go around and see human bones and things lying on the ground. So it was nice. So I'll just move on to the next question, which is from Weird Flex or Word Flex, WYRD Flex. And Weird Flex says, do you suppose that meditative states are more conducive to supersensible encounters, for example, ghosts, spirits, devas, etc.? Meditative states. Well, according to Orthodox Theravada, if you get into jhana states, then you would be getting into a realm of subtlety that is like the abode of Brahmas. Like according to Orthodox Theravada, you have to have attained jhana in order to get into the Brahma realms after you die. You know, it's a very high heaven realms. So it would probably increase the subtlety of your mind, like the subtlety of your vibe, so that you'd be more likely to see, you know, more subtle beings. With regard to ghosts, maybe, I'm not sure, but it would depend on what kind of meditative state you were cultivating. So, I mean, some really advanced like gurus, swamis, meditation masters, they apparently can see beings that we can't see, or also they can just see a person, they can just see right through you. Like Neem Karoli Baba, who was a Hindu in India. I mean, when he would look at you, he would know you better than you know you. He would just see, you know, where you were at karmically. You know, he'd see your past lives, supposedly. Just, you know, he'd see it all. And I think the heron or pterodactyl just tried to land again. We got the dogs out in front. But getting back to the question, I get distracted by things happening in the window. Let's see. So, let's see. Do you suppose that meditative states are more conducive to supersensible encounters? With regard to some of them, yeah, and it would depend on what kind of meditation you were doing. I mean, if you're just like counting your breaths or some kind of elementary meditation like that, just reciting the qualities of the Buddha or something, it might not make much difference. But if you're getting to subtle, you know, subtle detached mental states, it may detach you from the limitations of an ordinary human with regard to what you're able to see. And of course, materialistic skeptics would just say, you just, you know, you're meditating so much that you're starting to hallucinate or whatever. But and that can happen too. But for the most part, they don't know what they're talking about. So I'll just move on to Weird Flex's next question. Are you at all familiar with the phenomenon of sleep paralysis? Do you think it's simply a biochemical thing, or could the hallucinatory descriptions given by victims, for example, the shadow people, be related to the lower realms? Well, it's like a, I don't know, neurophysiological thing where when we dream, we are paralyzed. Because if you're having a dream and you're not paralyzed, you'll act out the dream, you'll start sleepwalking or whatever. You know, you'll be thrashing around and talking out loud and all this. So, I mean, it is just built into us that there is a certain amount of paralysis when we are dreaming. Let's see. Or could the hallucinatory descriptions given by victims, for example, the shadow people, be related to the lower realms? It is common that some people will have sort of, they'll wake up with like some kind of, I don't know if this is a shadow person or not. It's a very common kind of nightmare where you wake up on your back and you've got some kind of like a dark entity like pressing down on your chest, and you can't move. I don't know. My father experienced that. I think that's probably where the the like the legends or the mythology of the succubus and the incubus, like in ancient Rome, where that came from. I read some ghost stories along those lines that they interpreted it as some kind of possessive spirit, like somebody who died in the house and considered it their house or something. That's possible, although it does seem to be fairly common in just it fits a kind of a stereotype description of what's going on. So it could just be a kind of archetypal kind of nightmare. And then when you wake up, you're paralyzed because of the dream paralysis. I had a what I consider to be a case of dream paralysis. Um, I've talked about it before. It was the legendary time when I was attacked by ogres. Like I was living just out under a tree out in the woods in Burma, and that forest was just infested with supernatural beings. One of my best friends at the time was he was a monk who had been a high school math teacher before he became a monk, and he had a degree in physics. I mean, he was an intelligent person, but he was telling me in all seriousness, there's naga dragons there. There's an assant, which is a kind of guardian spirit with taboos that you had to follow. You weren't allowed to pee on the ground on the hill that the assant was, and that sort of thing. And also, he told me that it was well known that there was like an army of yakas or ogres that had magic guns that could make you go insane if they shot you with them. And there was the famous case of this Hindu Swami who was meditating in the same place I was for a while, who he made the mistake of trying to make like an enchanted circle to protect himself. But apparently these ogres were territorial and it just pissed them off. And so they drove him insane. He just went into like a weird fugue state and was just wandering around, not knowing who he was, that kind of a thing, till he came out onto a highway, and somebody, out of the kindness of their heart, nursed him back to some semblance of normality. And I think he went back to India. But anyway, I just woke up one morning. I won't give you the full details. You can find those elsewhere, I think. But I didn't have a clock even. I just would leave to go for alms in the village at dawn. So I was looking up. I kind of propped up on one elbow like this to see if it was dawn yet, just kind of looking over at the horizon. And I started hearing like strange sounds, just like somebody playing a bass guitar over a really loud loudspeaker system down the valley a ways. And I was wondering, well, gee, I wonder what that is. And then I started hearing lots and lots of voices in my head, sort of like if you're familiar with Welcome to the Machine by Pink Floyd off the album Wish You Were Here. Towards the end, there's all these voices talking simultaneously. It's just like a chatter of talking voices. It was like that, and I knew that was in my head. And then I realized I was just stuck. I was frozen. I was just like propped up on one arm like this, just paralyzed. And I was thinking, well, should I be afraid? And I quickly ruled that out because that wasn't going to help anything. So I just thought, well, maybe if something is doing this to me and they're Buddhist, they'll be reluctant to keep doing it if I start reciting, Namo Tassa Bhagavato Arahato Sama Sambuddhassa. And sure enough, it all just poofed after I recited that like twice, maybe 3 times. 3 is the magic number. And then I was able to move and everything. And I made the mistake of telling a monk down at the nearby monastery about it. And he had a degree in English. I mean, he wasn't stupid. He had a university degree, but also at the same time, his whole body was just covered with these magical tattoos to protect him from witchcraft and the evil eye and ghosts and snake bite and stuff. And his eyes got really big, and he just said, "Don't be afraid. They're just testing you." But personally, I just think it was like a waking dream. That's why I had the dream paralysis. It's just I couldn't move. So I'd chalk that up to a waking dream, but who knows? Maybe it was magic ogres with guns. I don't know. So I'll just move on to Weird Flex's last question. Oh, but before I get to that, I mean, it's possible in some cases, but I think most sleep paralysis is just like a natural thing to keep you from acting out your dreams. So I move on to Weird Flex's last question. What are your thoughts on Mara? What motivation could he have for suppressing the Dhamma? Is it totally malefic or something born out of ignorance and wrong view? Well, anything malefic would almost necessarily, from the point of view of Buddhism, be born out of ignorance and wrong view. I mean, he's not all wise with right view, or he'd be like a saint. So, as is often the case, I'd have to give you two different answers. One is the orthodox official answer from the point of view of Theravada Buddhism, and then I'd have to answer just my own personal opinion, because I don't necessarily follow along with strict orthodoxy all the time. So, yeah, Mara, he's like the Buddhist devil. He's got three sexy daughters who tried to tempt the Buddha before he was, like, on the night that he became the Buddha, on the night of his enlightenment, but it didn't work. And the motivation that he has for suppressing the Dhamma is he doesn't want anyone escaping samsara, because he's like the lord of samsara. Unlike the Christian devil, he lives in the highest heaven realm of the sensual realm, the highest deva realm. He lives in the deva loka, or the deva world of the deities who delight in the creations of others. And he's got kind of his own territory up there, and he stays in some celestial palace with his three sexy daughters. And he doesn't want anyone becoming enlightened, because then they're like escaping his power, and he's got some kind of a power thing. He's a control freak or something. But there is it's a famous image somewhere in the texts of Mara holding Mahabrahma in the palm of his hand, just indicating that, Mara is the lord of what the Christians will call creation. Like in Christianity also, Satan is considered to be somewhat the lord of this world, and Mara is, that's one similarity between the Buddhist devil and the Christian one. But yeah, his motivation is just to keep as many beings under his rule as possible. So, there are some cases where, before the Buddha became enlightened, there's a sutta in the Sutta Nipata. I think it's the Padana Sutta, where Mara's trying to be friendly and nice. It's like, why are you doing this to yourself? Why don't you just live an easy life as a layperson and do sacrifices and acts of generosity and earn merit, and you can go to heaven in your next life? Because if Mara can't get you to be bad, he'll get you to be good, because if you go to heaven, you're still in samsara. Heaven's just a higher level of samsara than this world, just as hell is a lower realm of samsara. So that's one difference between the Buddhist Mara and the Christian Satan, is Mara is really not necessarily evil. He's just samsaric. Good and bad are both samsaric. And so if he can't get you to be bad, he'll get you to be good. So it's not totally malefic, it's just samsaric. I think I had this idea that if there really is a Satan, he'd be an atheist, and I think Mara's kind of, in a way, kind of that way too. Just very, there are people in this world that are just hyper samsaric, it's just, this is all there is. They take everything really seriously, they take money seriously, and social status seriously, and the car seriously, and, that's just, what their existence is based on. And I would assume that Mara is that way too. But my own personal experience, I don't think there's even any need for any cosmic bad guy, because we can mess ourselves up well enough. And Mara really can't do anything to us that is not in accordance with our kama or our karma for it to happen anyway. So, he doesn't really have any power to do anything to us that we're not literally doing to ourselves, because it's our own karma. So, I've really never taken it very seriously. I think Mara would be a kind of mythological being. But I mean, there are like malefic beings out there. So I'm not saying that there aren't any um, like supernatural malefic entities or beings, but that there'd be just one in charge, at the top, so to speak, sort of like Satan in Christianity or Shaitan in Islam. Um, I don't really think it's necessary. I don't think there's like an organizational structure to it. According to Buddhism, and I think maybe Hinduism also with their equivalent, that Mara is really not so much a person or a being as a position, because beings in heaven, including small g gods, including Brahmas, don't live forever. They might live a zillion gajillion years, but they don't live forever. So after one Mara has exhausted his karma and passes away into some other existence, he'll just get replaced by the next Mara. The same is true of Mahabrahma and Saka, king of gods, and so forth. Although I might have deviated or digressed from the answer here. So we'll just move on to the next question. This is from Rakasa. Okay, and he thanked me for an answer I gave him about, he was asking me about um, why the Buddha would give such bad definitions for terms. And he says, to clarify, the definition of sorrow was from the Mahasatipatthana Sutta translated by Bhikkhu Sujato. For dukkha sancha, Buddha first gave a list of items that constituted dukkha, rendered as suffering, and then defined each item. And what is rebirth and what is sorrow, etc. What struck me was that all the other items had fine definitions, but not sorrow. So then he says, for the next Q&A, so it was probably pointless for me to even listen to read that part. Do you feel studying the more refined logic of Mahayana is worthwhile? The more refined logic of Mahayana. Reading Mahayana texts is worthwhile, even like a strict Theravadan. I have met some really strict Theravadins who did not want to read anything that wasn't strict Theravada. They didn't want to be reading wrong view. So they wouldn't, I mean, not only would they not read like fiction, novels, they wouldn't read, Hinduism or Mahayana or anything like that. And in a way, it just strikes me as being dogmatic. I mean, you can derive wisdom from reading Mahayana texts. The more refined logic, yeah, I have mentioned more than once recently that Mahayana Buddhism, partly because it arose centuries after the earlier schools, it has a more refined kind of logic, because apparently in the Buddhist time, there was no Indian equivalent of Aristotle, like developing like good rules of formal logic. And so in the Theravada texts, the logic is kind of sketchy. Sometimes it's not very good logic from like a modern Western point of view, or even a classical Greek point of view. So by the time Mahayana arose, a few centuries later, apparently either they did have some kind of formal logic developed in India, or else it maybe just even came from trade routes from Greece or Rome. So yeah, some Mahayana just like tramples on logic too, but it's all part of a logical. There's method to the madness. One of the most important Mahayana books I ever read was called Buddhist Logic. It's really old, translated by a Russian fellow named Cherbatsky. This was even before the Russian Revolution, the first one. So he was in St. Petersburg in Russia, like 1915 or something. But there was a school called the Yogacara Logicians. Also, I think it's called the Dignaga School, where, I mean, they were just developing Buddhist logic, and it's well worth looking into. It's some of it is profound. Like It was Dignaga, or one of his disciples, who came up with the idea, which I agree with, that if you have a sensory datum and no interpretation of it, you've got the Vedana but not the Sanya. You've got the sensory datum but no perceptual interpretation of attributing meaning to it. It's the same as there's nothing there at all. So that's kind of nice. One real breakthrough I had that inspired me to write my very first Buddhist essay it came from reading volume 2 of Buddhist Logic, where they're talking about what was it? Feeling and perception. I think that was it. How feeling and perception are always supposed to be, they arise together. And I'm thinking, like, it's like, what comes first? It's like, do you direct your attention to something which causes you to perceive it? But I mean, if you're not perceiving anything yet, I mean, why would you direct your attention to it? Why do you direct your attention to something before you perceived it? But if you've already perceived it, then you've already seems to have directed your attention to it. And there was some statement in there that it was like, the directing your attention and the attributing significance are just two aspects of the same phenomenon. It's sort of like a thing in its behavior, like verb and noun. It's like the way the human mind works is we divide everything up into things and the actions of things. But really, you can't really separate a thing from the action of the thing, assuming that just sitting there is an action. It's behavior. So a person and their behavior, the person as this body, this noun, and their behavior, which are the verbs, really it's just like an illusion to separate them. And that's the way it is with, perceiving something and directing your attention to that thing. They're both just two aspects of the same thing. And so I consider like Vedana and Sanya to be just two aspects of the same thing. And just going with logic, if you've got two things that have to arise together, they pass away together. And I mean, there's no way you can have one without the other. Then, I mean, they occupy exactly the same point in time and space. Then, I mean, they're just two aspects of the same thing. So consciousness and mental states are similar too. I mean, there's, as far as I'm concerned, two aspects of the very same phenomenon. Instead of the way Abhidhamma does it, it just divides them into like absolutely different, qualitatively different from each other. So, do I feel studying the more refined logic of Mahayana is worthwhile? If you're into that, I mean, it's not necessary. You can become enlightened without it. But if you do want to be knowledgeable with regard to Buddhist philosophy, or if you're just sort of a logical person and that kind of just thinking logically, like investigating Buddhist philosophy with some Buddhist logic behind you, yeah, it's worthwhile, I think. Like Nagarjuna was a kind of logician, and he's like a Mahayanist patriarch. And he's definitely profound. I consider him to be one of the greatest philosophers of all time. And he was into logic, like the Mula Madhyamaka Karika, which is his most famous text. It's essentially a kind of logic text. And going with Buddhist logic, it's like you've got 4 different possibilities with regard to any kind of like question. You've got yes, you've got no, you've got yes and no, and you've got neither yes nor no. And he attributes that fourfold division of possible answers to pretty much everything, and demonstrates that none of them really apply. The whole thing is just invalid. But I think I'm digressing again, so I'll just move on to the next question. And this is from Hayet's Tig. And Hayet's Tig says, is it possible to ordain for a relatively brief period, say 1 to 3 years, in the Theravada tradition? And so I would say to to you that, hey, it's Tig, is he doesn't know about Burmese or Thai Buddhism, because not only can you be ordained for a relatively brief period of 1 to 3 years, you can be ordained for 1 to 3 days. That there are a lot of old Burmese guys who brag about how many times they've been ordained as a monk. You know, some of them are way up into double digits, because it's just a tradition. Like during the New Year's festival or on their vacation from work, they just go and get ordained for, you know, a week or whatever. And it's called, in Burma, it's called the Donlaba ordination. Donlaba is the Burmese pronunciation of Dudlaba, which means hard to get, hard to obtain, because human life is hard to obtain. You know, most beings in this universe are not human, and to be a human during a time when you've got Dharma in the world is even more rare and more difficult. And to actually be exposed to monks and to have the opportunity to be ordained as a monk, that's very rare. So the Burmese consider it to be very meritorious for a man or for a boy to be ordained into the Sangha. Boys would be ordained as novices rather than fully ordained monks. And I mean, even the king of Thailand does this. It's a tradition that the king of Thailand, before you know, when he's still like a teenager, he'll be ordained, and even though he's soon to be the king, or maybe he already is king, you know, still he'll take his bowl and walk for alms through the village, probably getting like really first-rate food from rich people wanting to give the king food. But yeah, it's fairly easy, especially in Burma. You don't even really have to be a Buddhist in a lot of places. So yeah, the answer to that is yeah. I'll just move on to the next question. But I mean, if you want to go to a Burmese meditation center and you're qualified to be ordained as a monk, and you could just be ordained as a monk for the month that you're there, or the 2 weeks that you're there, or whatever, if they're willing to do that. So I'll just move on to the next question. This is from Sacha, Sacha. And Sacha asks, do you have the impression that your defilements have been reduced by your years of practice? And I would say yeah. Yeah, I mean, there's definitely results from effort. Even if you don't notice the results, especially at first, still there's definitely, any effort you make to practice Dharma is going to yield fruit. Just like what I was saying about fear earlier, just learning just the basics of Buddhist mindfulness, where you can detach from any kind of pleasant or unpleasant, especially unpleasant mental state, you know, so that it's not you anymore. Like, it's not I'm pissed off, it's just anger is arising. Or, you know, I'm afraid. It just becomes, you know, fear is arising, and then you observe the fear. So that kind of thing has helped. Just understanding things a little better, understanding karma better. Um, it's definitely helpful. But then again, I mean, this is kind of a logical fallacy, I think, because it's hard to say uh, what kind of mental and spiritual state I would be in if I just had never become a monk in the first place. You know, it's hard to say. Maybe you know, having a wife and kids would somehow be fulfilling some kind of need that I had deep down or something. I'm not sure. Or maybe just picking the wrong girl to marry, and just being put through the ringer. You know, it would be like a huge ascetic practice and paying off some huge karmic debt or something. I don't know. But my impression is that having been a monk for 30 years has definitely had a positive effect on my spiritual state. So I will move on to the next question. This is from Mon Comte. I think I pronounced that right. Mon Comte. And Mon Comte says, can insight happen without the jhanas or tranquility, stillness of mind? I see so many people do like insight meditation, and actually to me it sounds so weird because it's something that I never caused but rather something that occurs by itself once I got out of jhana or before jhana, once you've reached a fair amount of tranquility, stillness of mind. Can insight happen without the jhanas? Yeah, insight can happen without the jhanas, although it is true, I do not like the whole equation of, of insight with mindfulness. Like mindfulness meditation in the West is called vipassana, which is the Pali word for insight. So, yeah, I mean, they're very different. Practicing mindfulness is something that you do, but insight is something that spontaneously arises. And it can spontaneously arise after jhana. Like you come out of a jhanic state where you're not thinking anymore, and then insight can arise. Like, for example, a very simple one is you get into a meditative state where you're not thinking, you're just wide awake and your mind is just empty and clear. You know, it's not blank. You're more awake than you are normally. But you realize, you have this insight that when you stop thinking, you don't just become unconscious. In fact, you become in some ways more conscious than before when you were thinking. Partly because if you're thinking, your attention is focused on your thoughts. You know, if you're perceiving anything, your attention is focused on what you're perceiving and thereby limiting it. You're ignoring everything around it to some degree. Whereas if you're not thinking anything, you're not perceiving anything in particular, your mind is like a mirror. It's all there with equal clarity, like a cheap camera that doesn't require any kind of focus. Everything is just equally in focus. But I mean, you can have insight without jhana, definitely, just through practicing mindfulness. Like I was saying earlier, if you're mindful of fear, for example, so that you create this detachment, the insight can arise. Well, the fear isn't me; it's just this mental state that's arising. And so long as you don't get lost in it, it's not you. So yeah, I mean, it can happen either way. And some people that do attain jhana, or they do tranquility meditation instead of mindfulness meditation, it just becomes like a substitute for narcotics. You know, they just go into this zone. You know, they just blissed out, and they don't really get much benefit from it. I've met a lot of people who are really good meditators. They just sit like a statue for, you know, they can sit there for 2 hours. But then when they get up, they're just as messed up as they were before. It's like it didn't seem to do them any good. It's just like they've got a compartmentalized mind, you know, different rooms, and just this one compartment of their mind got really good at meditation, but it doesn't really translate into the rest of their personality. So, I mean, that happens too. The Buddha did, I mean, going with the suttas really emphasize the importance of jhana. You know, like in the Mahasatipatthana Sutta, right concentration is defined as the 4 jhanas. So jhana is something that's good to cultivate if you can. It's much more difficult for a layperson to cultivate it than a monk who's just a full-time meditator. Mindfulness generally works better for lay people, and especially Western lay people who are compulsive thinkers anyway. Let's see. Have I answered this question sufficiently? I'll ask the question again. Can insight happen without the jhanas or tranquility, stillness of mind? I see so many people do like insight meditation, and actually, to me, it sounds so weird because it's something that I never caused, but rather something that occurs by itself once I got out of jhana or before jhana, once you've reached a fair amount of tranquility, stillness of mind. Well, even if you're practicing mindfulness, there's at least your mind is calming down. So there's that too. And mindfulness and like jhana or samatha meditation, they're not mutually exclusive. I mean, you can have both going on at the same time. In fact, 4th jhana is called purity of mindfulness. So the more mindful you get, the more calm your mind is going to be, at least in a certain extent, to a certain extent. I mean, if you're being mindful of anger or something, still there's that still place that's watching the anger. So I'll just move on to the next question here. The answer to that one was yes. So this one, another one. Can we fall down into becoming information junkies? Let me explain. I see so many people, including myself, spending more time ingurgitating information and theory about the path than actually meditating or being mindful. So my second question would be, how long should we spend on studying and practicing? Well, yeah, I mean, ultimately, it's not thinking that's going to get you enlightened. You're not going to understand reality by thinking about it or thinking about anything really. I mean, there have been a few, like, there's a famous English monk, Jnanavira, who believed that he had become an Arya just by thinking while he was doing meditation, walking meditation. You know, he's just like hammering out this super intellectual understanding of Dhamma, and he thought that he became an Arya by just by hitting on this intellectual right view. But like I said before, you're not going to understand reality by thinking about it. So it's like thinking it. I mean, the best use you can use for thinking is to help you stop thinking. It's like the more you know, the more you realize you don't know, kind of a thing. There was a Mahayana text. I've got the quote written down here somewhere. It's like the purpose of Lord Buddha is to liberate us from our thinking by means of our thinking. Or like the words of the Zen master, or like the arrows of a master archer who can shoot down another arrow in midair. And so the words of the Zen master just kind of hit the words of the person he's talking to, and then they just both fall down to the ground, and you just got this emptiness behind. So that's like the best use for thinking, other than as a bullshit detector. That's one of the best uses for intellect. Is it can help you from believing bullshit. So critical thinking can be very useful, at least as a way of defending yourself against, you know, crappy views. So so the question here is, how long should we spend on studying and practicing? Well, I mean, for different people, it's going to be different amounts. You just want to study enough that you know how and why to practice correctly, and that should be sufficient. But I mean, we do have like a restless, hungry kind of mind, so sometimes just feeding it information can be the lesser of two evils. Otherwise, you might just be like climbing the walls with boredom or some such. But as a general rule, really what you need to know is how and why to practice, including how and why to meditate correctly. And you should never be too sure that you already know. Even if you think you know, still it's good to be open-minded and continue exposing yourself to various points of view, including, you know, different spiritual systems. So the question, how long should we spend studying and practicing? As little as possible for you to be, you know, at peace. Like one of the founder of the tradition which I was ordained, Venerable Taungpulu Sayadaw, had his spiritual advice, or just a little motto, is eat less, sleep less, think less, talk less. And probably read less would be another one you could add to that. So, I mean, you're definitely going to have better luck practicing Dhamma correctly in a forest with like some meditation master than you would at Oxford University in like a Buddhist studies program. Ajahn Chah used to say that scholar monks usually don't get anywhere, just because they're just emphasizing intellect, and enlightenment is not intellectual. Like true wisdom is not intellectual. And if you just get stuck in that, which is what like scientific materialists do, they're just completely stuck in this intellectual approach of perceiving things, which is like symbolizing the world and then acting as though the symbols have this one-to-one correlation with the reality, when that is not necessarily the case. So I think I'll just move on to the next question here. This is from Ancient Minds. So I welcome Ancient Minds to the Q&A because I don't think he's asked anything before, or she or they, I guess it's minds in plural. How did the first self, whether human, animal, or vegetative, become embodied when there was not yet karma? Well, that's kind of an interesting question, but the answer is there was no first self. From the Buddhist point of view, samsara is beginningless and presumably endless. And so it's always been this way. There was no first being to become embodied. Or going with my old simile of the block of marble. I mean, the block of marble always has and always will have an infinite number of like virtual statues contained within it. And that's the way samsara is. It always has had and always will have an infinite and just an infinitude of beings because they're possible. And if it's possible, it's going to happen in an infinite universe. So yeah, it's kind of an academic question since there was no first self. So Ancient Minds asks the next question here is karma is like momentum? Question mark. I thought karma was a condition that requires a subject to be put under said condition, a subject capable of performing actions. Well, ultimately, there is no subject. Yeah, karma, literally from the Buddhist point of view, is cetana, or usually translated as volition, although I think will or even urge might be a better translation than volition. So karma is like Schopenhauer's will. It's just this sort of a usually or often I will describe it as just the momentum of your mental states. It's like the verb aspect of your mental states. So I guess earlier when I was talking about feeling and perception, that was wrong. It was like volition and perception. So it's the perception of interpreting something and the volition of directing your attention to it in order to interpret it. So yeah, I was confused a little earlier. It's been a long time since I wrote that first essay. So I consider volition and perception to be two aspects of the same thing. So at least I caught that one. Sometimes I'll misspeak, I'll say the wrong thing, and then I don't notice it until after I see the video. So karma is, yeah, it's like the momentum of your mental states, of like your judgments, your perceptions, and so forth. And if you are not fully conscious, it acts as just the force of habit. It's like an autopilot that just keeps pushing you through life. So whenever you're not fully conscious, which for most people is pretty much always, then they're just running on automatic pilot, and that automatic pilot is a manifestation of karma. So I mean, it can be interpreted differently. Most people will interpret karma as just like some as yet undiscovered law of physics, like what's his name, Isaac Newton. Every action has an equal and opposite reaction. So if you do this, then the equal thing will have to happen back to you, kind of a thing. And there is a certain element of that, but ultimately karma is a mental state, and it's sort of a process mental state. It's like a verb mental state instead of just a static, single mental state. It's like this flow. It's like the stream of volition or of will, like Schopenhauer's will. So I'll just move on to the next question. From Rafi46. How important are Buddhaghosa's commentaries on the Pali Canon in Theravada Buddhism? Well, that depends on what country you're in, what tradition you are following. I really can't speak much for Thai Theravada or Sinhalese Theravada. I think they probably don't put as much emphasis on Buddhaghosa. Ironically, since Buddhaghosa was writing his commentaries in Sri Lanka. But in Burma, to some degree, Buddhaghosism is even more important than Buddhism, which is it's kind of ironic, and it used to really bug me as a monk. But when you're like in Burma, they've got like a medieval attitude towards Buddhism. Like it's sort of like a medieval Christian attitude, like medieval European attitude towards, you know, the Catholic Church. It's similar among Burmese monks, that it's like everything in the books is correct. Everything in the tradition is true, it's right. And that includes the commentaries, because sometimes the commentaries from the Burmese point of view are more important than the suttas themselves. Because if in the sutta, the Buddha says blue, but the commentary says, well, when he said blue, what he really meant was red. If you didn't have the commentary, you wouldn't know that it really means red when the Buddha says blue. And that may sound like kind of a joke, but you know, there are plenty of cases. Like one of the most famous is where the Buddha says that because of ordaining nuns, Buddhism, or the Saddhamma, the true Dhamma, will last for only 500 years. And the commentary says, well, when he said 500, what he meant was 5,000. Because they couldn't really go with 500 because the commentaries weren't even written down until more than 500 years later, and they couldn't, you know, they couldn't entertain the possibility that, you know, they weren't really Buddhists anymore, that true Dharma had died already. So how important are Buddhaghosa's commentaries on the Pali Canon? I've met a few, maybe several Western monks that never bothered to even read even the Visuddhimagga. But I mean, if you want to be informed, you know, you want to be literate and educated in Theravada Buddhism, it's good to be familiar with the commentaries. A lot of the time, the commentators are just guessing. They don't really know, you know, and usually they don't admit that they're guessing, so that they just make a guess. Sometimes it's a wrong guess, and then that just gets, it just ossifies into dogma, where that's the way it is, even if it's not correct. So let's see, how important are Buddhaghosa's commentaries on the Pali Canon Theravada Buddhism? Again, it's like to a Western Theravada Buddhist, there's almost no real, you know, they're just not authoritative. Like I never considered the commentaries to be authoritative. I could see plainly enough that in some ways they deviate from the text, in some ways they misinterpret the texts. But if you're just a devout, like Burmese Buddhist monk with a pre-modern attitude, and you just cannot doubt any of it. Like somewhere in the commentaries it says that the Buddha was 27 feet tall, and there was a Tipitaka Dharasiyaro, Mingun Tipitaka Dharasiyaro, and a Tipitaka Dhara is someone who has memorized the entire 3 Pitakas by heart. So it's like 40 volumes. So it's like you've got somebody who has memorized by heart, like the Encyclopedia Britannica, including like the knowledge in brief. And this man was brilliant. I mean, not only did he have a really good memory, but he was like a real intellectual scholar. But because he was Burmese, he could not doubt that the Buddha was 27 feet tall. So he had to come up with this elaborate theory. I mean, he read the suttas well enough to know that the Buddha really wasn't that much taller than anybody else. I mean, he was tall, but he wasn't taller than a giraffe. So he had this theory that, well, in the Buddha's time, people were more virtuous, and because they were more virtuous, the gods loved them more, including the gods who controlled the weather or who can influence the weather. So the weather was more conducive to growing nutritious crops. The rains were timely and so forth. No droughts were not nearly as many. The food was more nutritious, and so everybody was way bigger than they are now. And that's how he had to deal with the commentary saying the Buddha was 27 feet tall. He could not doubt it. But I mean, commentaries say things that, I mean, even the texts themselves say things that a modern or postmodern Westerner cannot believe easily. So I'll just move on to the next question. And this is from BPAT427. And BPAT427 says, who is creating more bad karma? A psychopath who kills people for fun with no accompanying negative mental states afterwards, or a mentally stable person who kills with wholesome motivation to protect others and feels regret afterwards? I would say, I mean, it's going to vary from person to person. I mean, you can't just give a blanket explanation because, um, like for example, the the mentally stable person who kills with wholesome motivation to protect others and feels regret afterwards. Well, I mean, how much regret? That kind of a thing, you know, or how did they kill the others? You know, it's going to depend a lot on the mental states of the individual. In fact, it's going to depend entirely on the mental states of the individual. So, all in all, though, in general, I would say the psychopath who is devoid of compassion and devoid of any kind of conscience, at least at the conscious level, is going to be creating much more bad karma. Um, Partly because, like a psychopath, they have almost no access to the subconscious mind. It's like they're completely cut off from the deeper levels of their own mind, but those deeper levels are still there. So deep down at like a subconscious level, they're aware of the suffering they're causing to others. You know, it's having an effect on them. It's just not at a conscious level. And that's kind of the way karma works too. It's you know, we're not aware of what direction we are heading, but it's in there. It's at a subconscious level. So the psychopath is causing like severe subconscious damage to himself, and without knowing or caring at the conscious level. But some people, I mean, they can be well intentioned, but then they'll do something. Even maybe they killed somebody accidentally, and then they'll just be like eaten up with remorse afterwards. And that remorse is really worse karma than, like, if you accidentally kill somebody. Let's say you're working on a roof and you drop a hammer accidentally and it hits someone in the head and kills them. I mean, that was completely accidental. I mean, the person hasn't necessarily done anything wrong other than just not being fully conscious, which, you know, is pretty much everybody. You know, everybody can make a mistake. And so almost all of the bad karma they're going to get from killing that person is going to be from regret, or just being upset from when the person's family is calling them a murderer or whatever. But so, I mean, the regret can just, I mean, a person could go to hell just over regrets. And it doesn't even have to be over anything good. I mean, like you can have a devout Jewish person who tries to follow, you know, all the Mosaic law. You know, they try to be completely kosher, and then one day they eat some apple pie, and it turns out there was lard in the crust because lard makes really good pie crust. And it was like the person didn't realize that, you know, they didn't think. And then so this Jewish person eats the lard, and according to the Old Testament, you eat the fat of some animal that is not suitable for sacrifice, and much less, you know, eating, let alone eating pork, then that's it. You're cut off from your people. You're no longer a Jew. You're no longer one of God's chosen. And I mean, just so, I mean, that person might just be just eaten up with remorse and just completely persuaded they're going to hell or whatever because they accidentally ate some pie with lard in the crust. So again, it's going to depend on the individuals, but for the most part, I think a psychopath who kills people for fun with no accompanying negative mental states. I mean, doing something for fun is already, it's got some bad karma in it because that's wallowing in sensual pleasures. You know, you're wallowing in sensuality, even if you're just, you know, killing a prostitute for jollies. Yeah, I mean, you're still, I mean, most of these people are just following this inner compulsion. And so it's like a strong attachment. And so, I mean, even that is big karma. And, but as I was saying, it's most of the damage they are causing to themselves is subconscious because a psychopath is just kind of cut off from their deeper levels of their own mind. They're just got a superficial kind of a mind, or at least that's my interpretation. So let's just move on to BPAT 427's next question. And this is kind of a long one because I have to sort of recite some rap music lyrics, but I won't be doing the rap kind of a thing, so please bear with me. Based on the lyrics of part 3 and 4 of this song, do you think that these rappers have at least a rudimentary grasp of Dhamma? And I'm sorry, I forgot to even record the name of the rap song or the group that is rapping. I don't know. Those of you who are into rap music, maybe you'll know this, but parts 3 and 4 of this song, this rap, if you can even call rap music a song, because they're not singing. Okay. Ooh, ooh, could it be that heaven is fleeting and always, and nothing is forever, and wishing will get you nowhere? Ooh, ooh, what a dream, go to sleep and wake up tomorrow. Funny how I'm always on the head of the arrow. Ooh, ooh. Ooh, ooh. Funny how I'm always on the head of the arrow. Ooh, ooh. Could it be that heaven is fleeting and always, and nothing is forever, and wishing will get you nowhere? Ooh, ooh. What a dream, go to sleep and wake up tomorrow. Funny how I'm always on the head of the arrow. Ooh, ooh. Ooh, ooh. Ooh, ooh. Ooh, ooh, ooh. Beauty is my drug. I'm the pusher. Push it. We think we exist. That's why we suffer, do we not? Sweet but treacherous is the poison, baby. Give it to me raw. Death is beautiful. Death is beautiful. Give it to me raw. Death is beautiful. Give it to me raw. Death is beautiful. 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 We think we exist. That's why we suffer. Do we not? Do we not? Give it to me raw. Death is beautiful. 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 Do we think we exist? That's why we suffer. Do we not? Do we not? Give it to me raw. Death is beautiful. Beautiful is my drug. I'm the pusher. We think we exist. That's why we suffer. Do we not? Sweet but treacherous is the poison, baby. Give it to me raw. Death is beautiful. So let's get back up here to the question, because okay. Based on the lyrics of parts 3 and 4 of this song, which I just recited to you, now you know I am not a rapper. Do you think that these rappers have at least a rudimentary grasp of Dhamma? Yeah, I'd say they got at least a rudimentary grasp. Let's see, there's a few kind of Dharma statements in here. Heaven is fleeting and always, and nothing is forever. Yes. Yeah, anicca. Everything is inconstant. See, ooh, ooh, what a dream, go to sleep and wake up tomorrow. Well, that's not necessarily anything. Let's see. Heaven is fleeting and nothing is forever. I already said that part. So, beauty is my drug. I'm the pusher. Push it. I don't think so. We think we exist. That is why we suffer. Yeah, I mean, that could be interpreted as some kind of Buddhism or something. So, yeah, I mean, they might not be familiar with Buddhism. Maybe they are familiar with Buddhism. I don't know. But there's, yeah, at least rudimentary insight in there. But that would not be sufficient for me to actually encourage people to listen to rap music. So we'll just move on to the next question here. What do you think are some prerequisites for someone who wants to ordain as a Theravada monk? Well, first of all, you should have faith in Theravada Buddhism. Secondly, you should be free of debt. I mean, technically you should not be ordained if you are in debt. If you got any kind of obligations that you could be required by law to fulfill, then technically you're not supposed to be ordained as a monk. If you're a runaway slave, that's out too. So if you want to be a Theravada monk, you want to be a correct one. You want to be a good one, not just a clueless one, like one of those people that ordains for 2 weeks. You know, they still got all their money. They don't know the rules. They just think that they're just magically going to get good karma by wearing monk robes and going through a 20-minute long ordination ceremony. Yeah, if you're going to be a monk, try to be a good one. Try to follow the rules, which means you have to get rid of all of your money before you become a monk. And follow the rules, study the rules before you become a monk so that you'll know what rules to follow. You know, pay off your debts and get everything straightened out, clean your room, all that before you go to the monastery to be ordained. And you should be okay. So I'll just move on to the next question, which is from Chaplain. Chaplain says, what should I look for when searching for a spiritual teacher online or in my region as far as credentials? Well, credentials, with regard to like degrees or certificates or years under this master or whatever, it doesn't necessarily count for very much. Because, spirituality is not something that really you can verify with a piece of paper. So I think the first thing you should search for is the spiritual teacher is telling you things that are actually useful to you. If they're helping you to be happier, helping you to understand reality, then that's good. You may want to look into their personal conduct. If they're just going from one female disciple to another, that would turn off a lot of people. Any kind of like a teaching certificate from Spirit Rock, that would like rule them out pretty much already. Yeah, spiritual credentials from Spirit Rock, I think that's a disqualifier right there. Any of the kind of woke places where they're trying to recruit teachers of color just for the sake of diversity and inclusion. Yeah, that's not so good. But like a spiritual teacher, one of the best things you can do is just observe the spiritual teacher and see if they get upset, see if they're cantankerous, they're like in a bad mood sometimes. That's one of the best ways of kind of, you can't really tell how wise another person is if they're wiser than you. You can't really comprehend greater wisdom than yourself, except maybe through, when things are going pear-shaped, things are just, the shit's hitting the fan and they remain calm and serene. That's a good indication that they've got wisdom. But mainly, I think you're better off just, if they've got a book or they've got videos or something, watch those. And if it really resonates with you, it seems to help you, then you can avail yourself of what they have to offer, at least provisionally. You may not want to throw yourself at their feet and declare them your guru for the rest of your life. But also, like the endorsements of other people you consider to be wise would be good. Like Ram Dass is very strongly endorsed Neem Karoli Baba, and that's one of the reasons why I became interested in Neem Karoli Baba. And so, yeah, out of respect for Ram Dass. But there are a lot of what do you call them? Just charlatans. There are a lot of charlatans out there. And then in the modern West, it's just spiritual Siberia, where you can have people that don't have much spirituality, much spiritual depth or maturity or wisdom going on, that nevertheless they've got something going on. They're good salespeople or something, and they get famous or make lots of money or become the head teacher somewhere. So it is true, you should be skeptical and watch people carefully, and if they're doing things that you thoroughly disapprove of, then yeah, you can have to question that. But mainly, the main thing I've done is just, you read their book or you listen to what they have to say, and if it really resonates in a deep place, just intuitively, it just feels right, then that's one of the best things you can do to decide whether they're going to be helpful to you or not. And again, just accept them provisionally. You don't want to just dedicate your life to this person just because they seem legit, because they may turn out to be not as legit as they seem. Because the charlatans are really good at seeming more legit than they really are. So I'll just move on to Chaplin's next question, and that is, are there any mainstream Western literary novels that aren't necessarily Buddhist but have an underlying Buddhist theme? And that's an interesting question. I've been thinking about this recently. Um, like, for example, you, I've considered like thinking about the Christian books I've read before. You know, I've read the Bible. I've read um, Science and Health: The Key to the Scriptures by Mary Baker Eddy, which counts as, you know, like, I've read the Book of Mormon. I've read like the autobiography of Saint Teresa of Avila. I've read, you know, the Ascent of Mount Carmel by Saint John of the Cross. But also, I've read like Dostoevsky's novel The Idiot. And I mean, does that count as Christian literature? Obviously, Dostoevsky was profoundly Christian, and the idiot, Prince Mishkin, in the novel symbolizes Christ at least one level of the novel. And so, um, in a way, I mean, it almost acts like scripture. You know, you can read certain Christian literature that's just, but written by a Christian person who's just sort of permeating what they're writing with their beliefs, and you're picking up, you know, sort of the wisdom of what this person is trying to convey just from reading a novel. And I've thought about like Buddhism. You know, there's obviously way less Buddhist literature in the West than Christian literature because, of course, the West is traditionally Christian. Buddhism hasn't been around in the West for very long, but there are some stories you can read that are Buddhist. I mean, one thing you can do is find translations of Asian books, like Alex Whaley translated Monkey, you know, so that kind of counts as Western literature. At least it's in English. But with regard to a Buddhist author writing original Buddhist stuff, my best guess would be J.D. Salinger. That I remember when I was living in a cave in Burma, this American monk came to visit me, and he was telling me about how he read in some Buddhist magazine that The Catcher in the Rye was a Buddhist novel. And that just seemed ridiculous to me at the time. It's like I didn't see it at all. I just started cracking jokes about it. Yeah, it was like Gilligan's Island's like a Buddhist parable also. You know, we're thinking, you know, ginger would be Tara and so forth. But then, years later, I read like the unofficial sequel to The Catcher in the Rye, which is Franny and Zooey by J.D. Salinger, and that was clearly Buddhist. I mean, they had, I mean, there's mention of, you know, the sacred books of the East and a polygrammars on their bookcase, and Zooey, I think it was Zooey. He said that he has to recite the Bodhisattva vows before he eats. One time he just deliberately skipped reciting the Bodhisattva vows before he ate, and he almost choked to death on a clam. And I mean, it was just more blatantly Buddhist. So that you translate that back to The Catcher in the Rye, which is very similar to this glass family that Salinger was working on later after writing The Catcher in the Rye. And then you can see, yeah, The Catcher in the Rye really is, it's Mahayana Buddhist, apparently. But if you look for it, it's there. And that's really the only one I can think of. There's really not a lot. I assume there's lots and lots of Buddhist literature, like Buddhist novels and so forth. Some of them, most of them probably, you know, second or third rate at best. But Salinger is worth reading, and he definitely had a spiritual side to him, definitely. Like he wrote a short story called Teddy about this 9-year-old kid from New York City. I think he was 9, approximately 9, who's in this completely dysfunctional family. His parents just hate each other. He's got like this little sociopath of a sister. And I mean, he remembers his past lives. He was like this Indian, like a yogi who he could have become enlightened in his past life, but he dropped out and just kind of wallowed in sensuality, which delayed him one life. And so to compensate karmically for his deviation, he got reborn into this totally dysfunctional family. But he was essentially an enlightened being, and he's explaining it to this other guy. He was saying that he was just a little kid watching his little sister drinking milk, sitting in her high chair, and then all of a sudden it just struck him. it was God pouring God into God, which isn't very Buddhist. I mean, it was more Hindu, but there's a lot of that in Salinger. So if you're interested in some kind of Eastern philosophy, um, like permeating or infusing Western fiction, I would suggest Salinger, just largely because I can't think of anybody else. And Salinger is a good writer. So I'll just move on to the next question, which is the last question. And it's from Diane, who always gets the question in right before I do the video. It's just, just like in the action movies when the guy rolls right underneath the big iron door right before it closes. Her questions are like that. And her question here is, who created God, or did God create himself? And this is kind of reminiscent of that question up above that I already answered about, like, how did the first being start making karma? And there just was no first being. And let's just set aside the whole idea of God as the angry old man with the long white beard, much more epic than this one, sitting on the throne up in heaven with the angels. It's sort of like Santa Claus, except less jolly and with angel helpers instead of elves. Yeah, if you just set aside that and interpret God as just ultimate reality, sort of like Brahman in Vedantist Hinduism, then God was not created. God has no beginning and no end. God is the block of marble that's always been there, and then everything else is just sort of virtually, conditionally there inside, so to speak. So yeah, if assuming that there is a capital G God, which is like the absolute, the capital A absolute, just ultimate reality, the highest truth, the highest reality. Yeah, it's uncreated, it's unconditioned, like nirvana in Buddhism is unconditioned. It has no cause, no effect, no beginning, no end. It's like completely outside of time. So yeah, so who created God? Nobody created God. God didn't even create himself, because God is uncreated, just always been there, always will be. There's absolutely nothing that could possibly cause ultimate reality to change or disappear or anything like that. So that was the last question, and I'm creaking the chair again. So I hope you are more or less satisfied, or at least somewhat intrigued by my attempts to answer these questions. If you have any questions yourself about Buddhism, about meditation, about living as a monk in Burma, whatever, anything that you think I might be able to answer, you're welcome to ask it in the comments below. And please like and or subscribe, and take a look at the URL links, including my first 3 books are down in the links, or they should be. And be happy.